Very thrilled to have you all here. Thanks for coming. Last year when we did the show, we had about 100 of you here, and this year we have 400. So thanks for the enthusiasm. I want to start off by saying a big thanks to all our sponsors. Without you, this would not be possible, so thank you. We have a very packed, exciting agenda for the next 2 days. In the mornings, we will meet for the keynote talks here in this ballroom, and in the afternoons, we'll have the breakout sessions. We have a pretty wide range of tracks, from virtualization to VDI to cloud to backup to HA, and a very interesting set of speakers too, end users, industry experts, as well as vendors. So I'm sure you'll all enjoy the breakout sessions. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Please join me in welcoming our own Chief Executive Officer, Evan Powell from Nexenta Systems.
Okay. Thank you, Shakti, and thank you all for coming. And what I'm going to try to do is not directly pitch you on Nexenta Store, but it is sort of second nature for me to do that. So I apologize ahead of time if I start to do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is talk about what's going on. What do we see happening in IT, at least in our piece of IT, the piece of IT that is inclined towards openness, towards software-centric business models, and so forth. And I'll tell you a story about two bridges at the end as well. So the first point is I'm supposed to welcome you all. And unfortunately, my language skills don't allow me to say welcome in most of these languages. But we do have folks from right around the world. Apparently, it took as long to get here from the East Coast as it may have from, I think, Indonesia. We have folks from mainland China here, or at least registered, and maybe in the room or intending to be in the room. And the only other comment I'd make about this slide is this is a global phenomenon. Not just open storage, and I'm going to incline my remarks towards storage for obvious reasons. It's the area I know best. But also an open approach to the data center. I think it's truly global. Just to give you an idea, Nexenta is about 33% U.S., both in terms of sales and headcount. So we're truly seeing a global phenomenon occur here. And again, welcome. And I'm going to talk more about what I want you to do, what I'm hopeful that the people in this room are doing, and what we'd really love you to be doing as I go through this chat. But suffice it to say right now that we wouldn't be here, obviously, without you, without a community approach to storage and to data center infrastructure. Expectations. This is actually our own Craig Morgan at an event we had, a very similar event in Europe this year. And incidentally, I noticed some of the same people are in the front row. But what Craig is doing is having a conversation in a room not that much smaller than this room. So that would be our goal. Can we, at 9:15 in the morning, despite jet lag, have a conversation amongst 400 people, some odd people? That's our goal. I may not actually call on you. I mean, it looks here like Craig is actually pointing at somebody in the back of the room and saying, hey, you there, what do you think about open infrastructure or what have you? So I may not be quite that assertive, but I am going to leave time at the end so you guys can chat with me. And if I haven't met you, I'd like to try to meet you one-on-one as well over the next couple of days. But I am going to leave more or less 15 minutes, depending how fast I shoot through my next few slides, to try to have a discussion. And that's in this session, arguably the least discussion-friendly session of all of them. Generally speaking, in every summit event here, it's about conversation. So my team, the other teams here, all the presenters, they want to know what you think, right? And they also want to know what we should do better. So this show, such as it is, Summit, has grown, as Shakti said, by about 4x. What would you like to see next year, right? Because we expect to grow 3 or 4x again. So we're going to have more resources. What would you like to see? Be thinking about that as you go through the sessions. And come with, perspective. Come with a take, if you will. And please share your perspectives in the sessions. Feel free to tweet as well. I think, 7 partners are announcing participation here today. Probably another 3 or 4 on the way. So there's sort of a flood of visibility right now about this community. We'd like to keep that up, keep the conversation going in social networks and so forth, not just here physically. Landscape. Uncertain times. Not sure how this joke will go over, but that is not an advertisement for disaster recovery, although it could be. Obviously, that sign is supposed to say, "Where's my data?" But it is an uncertain time. And if you can't reevaluate your assumptions on, hey, how am I going to do IT now? When are you going to do it? The very fundamental assumptions about where growth comes from in the world economy have been changed, proven to be wrong, in fact. And certainly as a global company, we have to face that. But as a community, I think we have to face that as well. So if not now, when? When are you going to look at your data centers and say, I'm tired of having this kind of engagement with my storage vendor, right? Where every negotiation turns into a fist fight, where I have no idea what I'm going to pay for the next petabyte. I have no idea what I'm going to pay for the next petabyte. That's an absurd situation. And yet that is the situation in general in enterprise storage today if you don't take an open approach. It's not all bad news, though, is it? I think we take this stuff for granted in Silicon Valley, but holy smackers. Intel is speaking at the show. I've got a couple of slides on what they're doing. They're making possible stuff that was science, literally science fiction. Those of you who are Neil Stephenson fans, I mean, the guy was literally projecting some of the stuff happening today 15, 20 years ago. People kind of laughed at it. And I'm going to share with you some of that. So the stuff we can pull off today is mind-blowing if you have business models, if you have technologies that get out of the way of that curve. So we as a company believe that we shouldn't be in the way of Moore's Law. We think a lot of the speakers here, open storage, generally open infrastructure, the basic premise is, what right do we have to take advantage of Intel's CapEx and to use that to drive up our gross margins or dollars, et cetera? Why don't we come up with a business model that passes through these benefits to you and to the community? There are obviously going to be presentations on VDI, big data, there's cloud. There is a lot that we can do now as a community that we couldn't do before, thanks to billions of dollars of CapEx. So it's not all bad news. You've got the fundamentals of the world economy changing, but you've also got what's possible being transformed as well. And here's one of my favorite, I don't know if any of you are TED addicts or if you ever read or look at presentations online from TED, but IT does matter. This is a case that was presented at TED of growing human organs. It's happening. Why is it happening? It's happening because of IT, in part, enables you to do absolutely crazy stuff that you couldn't do before. And, as many of you know, some of our first customers were big genomics users and continue to be a big area. So IT does matter. But on the other hand, if you're spending all your money on plumbing, you don't have money to do this, right? So if you're not commoditizing what's not differentiated, you don't have the focus. You don't have the money in a world where money, at least in the U.S., is scarcer than ever. You don't have the cycles or the funding to do things like this. And for those of you who are into it, there's a great whole TED talk on using 3D printers to actually print livers. Now, they don't actually, just to be clear, you can't go out and buy a liver from Walmart quite yet, or you can't make one in your basement. But there is tremendous stuff happening all around the world. But we, I believe, as the infrastructure providers, have to deliver via business models that lets you as customers and users benefit from Moore's Law so you can do interesting stuff. We have one customer who's or at least one customer, one I'm thinking of, who's a user who's doing really innovative stuff with video, where what they want to do is not just have video for surveillance, but video for what does it mean? You know, what are my customers who are wandering around retail stores actually doing, right? And it turns out that if you slice the data correctly with cool software and you spend your money and time on the software, you can draw really interesting information out of where people are going, you know, in your store. Obviously, you can test different displays. There's a real ROI there. Unless you've spent 50% of your budget on commodity hardware to store the data. So commoditization, that's an interesting word. I don't know how well it really translates, but for me, what I mean by commoditization is a world in which you give up nothing and you know exactly what you're buying and you save money, right? So in other words, the creation of liquid markets, markets in which, again, solutions can be commoditized because they are defined. And that's the fundamental thing that you need if you're going to commoditize a market or a use case. You got to know what you're getting. And the good news is, at least in our patch in storage, it's pretty well defined. The number of users out there who know how to run storage with an NFS backend is enormous, right? So we've got a well-defined market. I did put in orange zero risk of data loss because there's a whole bunch of folks entering the market that are in a different market. They're in a market where you can lose data. And that is, you know, there's Facebook would be an example. You know what? If they lose a photo here or there, it's not going to kill their business. On the other hand, if you lose the design for somebody's bladder, that's rather more serious. Right? So what we're talking about in storage is commoditization with zero risk of data loss, with true enterprise class features as well. So that's a definition. That's something you can commoditize, just like you can commoditize a barrel of oil. You can commoditize processing power on an EC2 like cloud. I suppose you could commoditize pork bellies. And then a market that needs commoditization. So, you know, if it's a tiny market, commoditization makes no sense. And you need pricing that's egregious in some level, right? You need there to be an economic reason for folks to want to commoditize a market. And then we believe you need companies. You know, maybe it's Arista. I'm giving Andy his. They're well able to position themselves, but certainly we would say that's us for storage. You need next to choke. You need reliability. You need to not give up on what you really want, which is a vendor that is going to be there with you. So commoditization. And I'm not going to go through this in too much detail because I promised I wouldn't go into too much of a sales pitch just for Nexenta, and I want to leave time. But the reality is the storage world has changed massively because of hardware. And you know, we come here and say, hey, you know, open storage, we're leading this transition. Well, really? Is Evan leading this transition, or did Intel basically make this happen? And I'd argue it's Intel, right? A company whose CapEx expenditures on an annual basis are greater than the revenues of our biggest competitor. And what they've led to is a world in which everybody uses x86. It's all the same hardware, guys. So we come to you and say, hey, use industry standard hardware. Well, so is everyone else. You may not recognize it, but if you pop the front of those $1 million arrays, you're buying Intel. So thank you, Intel, right? Recently, EMC admitted as much in the press, right? They're sort of annoyed with certain press coverage they received, and they kind of came out and said, "Hey, we're all on x86 today." So what we're seeing is Intel with that 90% storage market share is transforming the industry. It's not us. We and other members of the open storage community just have business models that allow you to benefit from the incredible exponential improvements we're seeing. We're not the only ones. This is an open tent. To the last minute, we had talk of one of the big legacy vendors coming. And it's totally open, and that could be some feedback you provide to our team. Who would you like to see here next year? And we're trying to make it happen. Certainly the invite is truly open. So our pitch would be, look, the past, when folks launched industry enterprise class storage, they had to have a hardware-driven approach. You know, an X386, a 386 in 1995, probably wouldn't have handled a 128-bit file system. You can. I'm not the deep computer scientist like the other folks we have on our team, but I know that much. So they had to come out with proprietary hardware. And today the world is just massively different. The other thing I hope you'll see, not just from us, but from partners like, let's say, a Racktop or others that are here this week, is innovation. So when you free yourself from the mindset that we or others in the open storage community have to sell big boxes, then you can develop software-centric business models, and I think innovation can accelerate. So last week, we announced with VMware something called Nexenta VDI. We're the first to do it. It is a solution that enables you to automate some of your view provisioning and so forth. I don't think we could have gotten there had we been a hardware company. Well, I'm sure we couldn't have, because it's running as a VM. There's zero possible hardware dollars in that form factor, if you will. So in any case, software-driven IT, and I think Andy will talk, probably touch upon this as well. Focus on where you're really great, which is the software. Let's leave hardware up to the companies that are investing $10, $15 billion a year in building industry-standard hardware. So which niche? This is the kind of question we get, and you know, where is open storage really happening today? We get this a lot, and I'd love some of you guys to give me your feedback on this. But what we see is yes. It's happening across these niches, which is good news. It leads to a few sleepless nights, because we believe we have to have sort of the paint by numbers, the references, the partners, including some of the folks on this sheet, across each of these to really bring open storage to where it needs to be. So it means more work for us, but I can quote you, users in each of these verticals. The adoption is broad and global. Virtualization does seem to be a common element. So obviously, some big data is no virtualization needed or desired, but we see just a massive amount of virtualization across these big GIS deployments with mapping, right? Advanced mapping with folks like the U.S. Army, where virtualization is a component. A lot of cloud, obviously VDI, et cetera. Which niches? So again, we can talk more about it. So the hardware is the hardware. There's a whole session on the hands-on lab, and I'm going to steal some of their thunder right now. But suffice it to say that VMware is a customer of ours and of some of these partners that you see here. They were a customer for some cloud development they were doing. It had nothing to do with the very intensive workload of hands-on lab. So hands-on lab, for those who weren't at VMworld and who don't know this, is basically a lab, a hands-on lab. It's basically where you go into this room, probably 10 times as big as this one, with a couple thousand of your peers, up to a couple thousand of your peers, and you log on at VMworld to VMware products, and you do what-if things. You actually play with the products. You set up some sort of virtualized environment, etc. And when you're done, the system breaks it down. So very intensive workload. Our product was not purchased for that workload. It was purchased for a cloud development use case inside of VMware. However, as we did well through the course of the year, they kind of chatted with us and said, hey, why not run some of Hands-On Lab? And so we did. And this is the hardware spec. And again, there's a whole session on this with some of the people that actually designed, built, and ran this in Las Vegas and in Copenhagen. Those are Arista switches, by the way, up there. A lot of Supermicro, another partner here as well. More detail. And it was the news about this that caused that EMC vice president to say, hey, Nexenta store says they run on industry standard hardware, therefore, good things happen. Well, we run on industry standard hardware too. I think they kind of missed the point. We run on industry standard hardware, and we don't charge you for it. We don't even sell it. They run on industry standard hardware, and again, your pricing negotiation with them inherently, because of their business model, is adversarial. It's a fundamentally different approach to the market, but you get to the same endpoint. We would argue we have better technology, et cetera. And you can say almost the same thing about Arista's value proposition, right? Better software, industry standard hardware underneath it, and on down the list. So what did that actually mean? Big savings. We competed with and beat solutions that in one case were an entire array full of SSDs in order to get performance up. So I said it's the same hardware. Well, actually, they had to go kind of gold-plated on the hardware to get to the performance levels that were needed by the workload. So it's real. Who's in this community? Well, who wants to be in this community? It's got to be a heck of a lot bigger than us. The big icon that's not on there that I've already mentioned is Intel. In a way, we all live in Intel's world, right? And there's a continuum. So we have Nexenta here as being on the open extreme. Is that really true? Well, there's actually even more open solutions than Nexenta. We hold back some of our user interfaces and some other capabilities. So there's a balance there, right? We believe you have to have both a commercial solution that you sell on top of the open source and open source roots. But other people split the balance or make the balance happen differently. My point is basically to say you've got some of the most successful leaders in IT out there, brilliant and proven leaders, saying that IT is inherently verticalizing, and you're going to buy everything from one vendor, and that's the way of the world, And in the next breath, he probably says, and I'm going to be the world's richest man. And what we're saying is, really, we're not seeing that. And I'm pretty sure we're growing at least an order of magnitude faster than the legacy storage vendors out there. And that's, again, from the storage perspective. I think, I don't know exactly what Andy and Arista's growth rates are, but my understanding is they're at least our pace, if not even faster. So something's happening here, and it's not just, it's definitely not just us. Intel story is a pretty interesting one, right? You've gone from CPU being a bottleneck to an embarrassment of riches with the Intel form factors, and certainly we think with the Romley form factor, which we're going to launch with Intel in China, PRC, mainland China next year, we're going to be able to pull roughly 1 million IOPS out of a 2U box. you're a storage geek, you just heard something that I think will revolutionize over time the industry. Million IOPS out of a 2U HA box. It's not the CPU. The CPU is not the bottleneck. The folks that win are those that pass on the benefits of what Intel's doing to end users, but also use these CPU cycles to do smart stuff. SAS is about to be on the motherboard, right, or on the chipset. What that means is hardware RAID is dead. You can say I'm crazy, or you can pull up Intel saying the same thing a year ago at IDF, in which they said, hey guys, hardware RAID is dead. So we obviously think we have better RAID thanks to ZFS underneath us. So you get better data protection, zero risk of data loss. You're using the massive power of CPUs. And then you're partnering with Intel because you're a good solution like us that passes through those benefits and actually leverages the processing power. Another we don't have on here is dedupe. We launched dedupe when it was fairly cutting edge. It's matured quite a bit. It can be very, very useful for certain workloads. Compression is a default option on Nexenta Store. So the point is that Intel has really pushed the frontiers here of what's possible in storage and enabled companies that actually leverage those CPUs to outperform the legacy vendors. And that's what we're seeing. So we all depend on you. Trust, open standards, hardware independence, software-driven solutions. There are Arista being one. Companies at this show whose model is hardware. But they focus on hardware, I believe, as a way to tin wrap software. So the general theme, if I had to try to tie kind of a thread through many sessions here, many vendors, is an effort for transparency, an effort for openness, passing on the benefits of Moore's Law and other exponential improvements to you, focusing on software and winning where it counts, winning through differentiation, through value add in software. But before I throw it open to questions and start calling on some of you guys in the back, let me tell you a story of two bridges. Both built to carry 25 metric tons, roughly. Both built to survive 250 years, at least. Both built from concrete. Both designed by one of the world's top engineering firms. In fact, by the same engineers, including one of these people I am related to. Bridge A, built in Silicon Valley, part of an ecosystem restoration project. Bridge B, built in rural Guatemala, part of Farm to Market project. Which one cost more money and how much? Any guesses? What's that? A cost more. A cost a lot more. So what's going on? I don't know. So I put this together in the middle of the night last night. But to me, somehow it ties back to that first slide, one of those first slides where you literally see part of London burning. You see people annoyed at the current situation. If not now, when? If you're not going to look at better, cost-effective ways to get stuff done now, when are you going to do it? And this, the reason, I believe, is this was free of bureaucracy on the right. These were people who just basically wanted food to be able to get from the mountains to the people that needed it in the cities. And so they cut through the crap. They got it done quickly. They focused on what was really important to them, which was feeding people, as opposed to CYA, as opposed to process to an extreme, as opposed to whatever took $67 million to build what is effectively 100-year-old technology right down the street on the Guadalupe River in San Jose. So that's what we're talking about. I think we have a moment right now where we're forced to re-examine our assumptions about how to do a data center, where we're forced to actually look ourselves, frankly, in the mirror and say, hey, do I really need the but nobody ever got fired for buying X solution? Or am I going to get ahead of that? Because I promise you in a few years, people will get fired for buying solutions that were built, designed in 1995, and that cost 10 times as much as open solutions that are also on the market, and that are also winning the world's top storage and switching and infrastructure buyers. So are you going to jump now? Are you going to be part of the solution, part of the community? Or are you going to wait until you have these kind of really stark price comparisons, cost comparisons sitting in front of your buyers? So you're our secret weapon. This is, again, Amsterdam. It really does take, in any transformation, any social movement, if that's what this is, but any market shift, if you read Crossing the Chasm, basically what they're saying is we don't really trust a new way of doing things until we collectively trust that new way of doing things. And so our secret weapon is basically people are starting to trust that you can take open approaches to infrastructure. When you do so, you not only save money, you get better solutions like some of the things I've mentioned earlier, some of the things our partners are exhibiting here. Arista switching would be a potential example. And you also, you get to the future sooner, right? And you commoditize the stuff that ought to be commoditized so you can focus on things that save lives or make your businesses more competitive. So what I'm asking you guys to do is participate one way or the other, even if it's commenting on those bug reports you see online, or filing more bugs. Whatever the case may be, participate. Hold us accountable. Hold this community accountable. Come up with ideas. Tell us what we ought to do next. We haven't publicly announced it, but I mean, this company is growing quickly. I've got more resources to invest. Where should I invest them? Tell us. Please participate. It's the only way that this continues to move at the pace it's moving. And again, welcome. Shalom, etc. Again, sorry for my lack of language skills. I should point out that we do have a speaker from Korea Telecom here, I think later today. That's another bit of jet lag that was taken on to get here. And I think it's going to be really interesting for you folks. They're both using Arista and us and a lot of stuff they've written themselves, et cetera, to build and to manage the largest cloud in Asia. So that's one I would definitely put a pitch in for. And also, we try to give back. Incidentally, we're going to be announcing some new bits that we're open sourcing today or tomorrow. But we're also going to give back in the form of beer, so please join us. And if you don't want to ask a question now, I mean, first off, please ask a question now. Secondly, feel free to grab me tonight or anybody. Let's have this conversation and keep this conversation going. So thank you.
So I do have a microphone here, so if you have any questions for Evan, just raise your hand and I'll make sure the microphone gets to you.
Interesting thoughts here, Evans. Anil Vasudeva, IMEX Research Industry Analyst, so we'll be talking in that sort of a mode, if you will.
Great.
You know, there is fundamentally virtualization. What it did was bring us cost-driven, volume-driven economics. Very low-cost storage, the microprocessors, the memories, the NICs, all that, and join them together. So the key being held in was the system integration. Look at Apple, become the #1 company. What they do is great, is take these volume-driven components and able to systemize it and then be able to sell it. So isn't the future really, the last slide that you showed on from microprocessors, power being used for everywhere, isn't the goal here to do the system integration and become, because if you're selling shoes or drugs or mining or whatever, those people are very interested in system solutions.
Right.
So your message from the storage perspective, where do you want to take this company if those thoughts were the ones in your mind?
So the Apple case is an interesting one. Obviously, great company. When I was in business school, we studied a case on how Apple screwed it all up, right? And at that time, the argument was, if you remember when we went from 386s to what's next and the whole, is that by having a tightly coupled, fully integrated system, what did they do? They basically got in the way of Moore's Law, right? But at some point, it didn't matter. I mean, at this point, you know, if they're big enough that they can get there. But the argument is that today in storage, when you're doubling storage usage every 18 months, and when a lot of our buyers would like to double it even faster than that, getting in the way of Moore's Law is not a good place to be. Now, consumer electronics today, you know, this thing is probably pretty strong, right? And I'm not sure that their integrated solutions slowing down slightly, you know, are they going to lose versus somebody because the next guy has a slightly faster chip? I'm not so sure. Or better price performance? I'm not so sure. But 15 years ago, they did, right? There was that period of time when buyers were saying, my PC's not fast enough, my PC's not fast enough. What is this Mac? It's even slower than my PC. My PC's not fast enough. Give me the fast stuff. I believe where we're at right now in the market is people want cost-effective price performance in storage, absolutely. And getting in the way of Moore's Law is not a good idea. Now, buyers in storage buy integrated systems. So you're touching on a key point, which is, you know, yesterday, the day before, we had, I don't know how many partners, but 50 partners getting hands-on training in an Exenta store and literally sitting there and doing a what-if integration. Because we don't exist, and I think this broader community doesn't exist without system integration. But it's just we think our business model should not be to sell you an all-in-one box. We think we should allow the integrators to integrate, and we'll sell you the software, and we'll pass on those price performance benefits to end users.
I'd just like to comment a little further on that, actually. I'm from Washburn University. I'm giving a presentation tomorrow. And part of what we're dealing with is we have a number of siloed integrated systems that don't integrate well with each other and they don't scale well. And that can be the problem with integrated systems, and that's what really one of the big solutions Nexenta is providing for us. And so I think, you know, it's for specific applications, you know, those sorts of things are great, but that's not always the way things work in the real world when you're trying to work with a number of different things. Similarly, Apple produces some of the very finest consumer products in the world. Trying to manage them in the enterprise is incredibly difficult and getting worse because they are effectively dropping their enterprise support resources and so many cases leaving us in the lurch. It's very, very difficult. So like I say, that what works in one analogy may not work in another, and I can tell you from my standpoint, it's been going with Apple is not a preferred method, and going with a integrated solution, which doesn't work with anything else, also does not work very well for us.
Thank you.
Evan, hi. Terrence McClelland with Nordisk Systems. Thanks for having us. Could you touch on your VDI strategies or expand on it, if you would mind?
Yes, although I suggest people stop by and chat with Nordisk about some of their successes specifically in VDI. So an Exenta store serves as, you know, a back-end storage for lots of VDI deployments. As you know, an Exenta VDI is a companion product that we announced last week, which we're not shipping yet, but we will ship in Q1, which actually runs in VMware's product to automate the provisioning, optimization, and so forth of it. But we announced that we were best of breed for VDI, you know, roughly the time that a few people knew what the heck it was, right? Why? Random IOPS. I mean, the basic common denominator here for VDI, for cloud, is that if you pass on the benefits of Moore's Law, or at least the CapEx and SSDs to end users, you can get massively better price per IOPS. So that's probably why we're winning a lot in VDI. Underneath it all, it's price per random IOPS, which is one reason you see, of course, DDR drive may be giving away a commemorative edition of their SSD, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, SanDisk, OCZ, and others here, because that interplay is key here, and we do a good job leveraging SSDs, as you know.
Thank you. I'm Julia Palmer from GoDaddy.com. I
Great.
wanted to ask you about, I'm sure you're well aware of your competition, such as, emerging technologies out there, Gluster, Ceph. I would like to know your take on what's going to differentiate from you and them in the long run.
Well, I did study economics, and there's a famous saying about the long run, right? I don't know if you, which is, in the long run, we're all dead, right? But that's, anyway. It's also, anyway, we can talk economics over a beer, but I can argue both sides. So yeah, hopefully would be my answer. Hopefully that these systems will mature. It certainly looks like it. A file system, ballpark, rule of thumb, on the part of investors, and I think if you ask Scott McNeely and others who wrote the checks for the development of ZFS, they would say ballpark $150 million, 7 years to mature. And it's not the writing of the file system. I mean, a few of us took, CompSci 302 file systems, and at the end of that session, you come up with something that looks like a file system. 7 years, $150 million later, it's something GoDaddy should run, right, or what have you. It takes that kind of maturity. It's one reason we think these guys have a better shot at it, frankly, than the proprietary guys that are raising money. So, so you'll see us being increasingly active in some other open source, open storage communities, in part because we hope they do get there. I'm not sure, whether it's Gluster or ones you mentioned, OpenStack is here. There's some stuff happening in the cloud where, again, not necessarily ready for enterprise class, I will never lose your data, so help me, use cases, but with enough users, enough of you actually using this stuff, you could get there. The other one that you might have mentioned is BTRFS. And the inside joke at Nexenta is BTRFS is 2 years away from mainstream adoption and always will be. But we hope that's not the case. And we certainly try to participate in those communities to be there when other file systems mature. But mature is a key part of it. I mean, file systems are like seismic plates, right? They just take a long time to move and to stabilize. When BTRFS gets there, I promise you Nexenta will be there as well, if and when it gets there.
Question
there. How do you approach the problem of scaling beyond the confines of one storage array? Something like MooseFS, Ceph, what IBM does with
GPFS.
GPFS, yes.
Yeah. Good question. So, the first point is each storage array is getting bigger and bigger, right? And so just we had, as an example, at VMworld, one of our partners who is here, Aberdeen, was selling a petabyte on the floor in less than a rack. And when they go to, I don't think they're on 3 terabyte drives. But anyway, so you're going to have a couple petabytes, a few petabytes in a rack here, less than a rack, pretty darn quickly. And the head nodes, if you can pull 1 million IOPS out of them, I mean, right? So next year, you're going to have million IOP, half rack systems with a petabyte. And still, that won't be enough, right? So you're still going to need to answer this question. So how do you scale horizontally? And for us, today, the answer is, of course, we can run behind a cluster or something like this. But the typical answer for us going forward for NFS is our own NFS namespace cluster. And so that's, that is code that we've written ourselves. I don't know, do we have HPC? We don't really have HPC tracks much here. Yeah, so you'll be seeing us. We actually had I think they call it a Bake Fest with one of the big legacy vendors and a whole bunch of non-legacy vendors at their headquarters last week. And we were doing NFS 4.1. So we're hopeful there's going to be a industry standard way to get that kind of scale in the future through PNFS. But in the meantime, we can scale horizontally to your heart's content using a namespace cluster. So, which begs a question about block. There is more that we could be doing there on the block side as well. And you can expect us to do more there.
Hi, Evan. Steve Scher with Nordisk. Just as a follow-on to that question, we're working right now with something that we think is going to be pretty interesting to solve potentially that problem is in namespace cluster, specifically with Avir. With Avir in a straight NFS environment with Nexena as a back end, you get the speed and performance of the Avir front end with their caching, and behind that is the back end storage, Nexena, with their SSDs and their caching ability to essentially make a multi-head environment look like a single cluster, a single namespace cluster. So if you're interested in learning more about the Avir partnership with Nexena, we'd love to talk to you about it.
That's a good point. I think that was officially announced today, or the Avir partnership. So, maybe one more? Because
Sorry to go twice. Unrelated question to what it was earlier. I was wondering if you could comment on the forking of ZFS and ongoing community development of that.
I could. So, I don't know. Garrett is here somewhere. Yep, he's in back. So the short of it is we see partners like Joyent, others. There was a hackathon, I think, even this weekend, which was, we overwhelmed the facility we had set up for it, which tends to be our modus operandi as I look at people standing in the back. Yeah, it looks very good. Our ulterior motive, to be clear, in helping Illumos get going, and I should mention this, is that we've actually said for a long time there's going to be a foundation that will own Illumos, so that should something happen to Nexenta, right, you're not going to rely on, so you're not going to have a repeat of the Oracle Sun situation, basically. So that foundation is officially set up. We haven't officially, put out the press release on it, but as of yesterday, Garrett? Yeah, as of 1 p.m. yesterday, there is a foundation that actually has the Illumos bits. Our ulterior motive there was in part, when we have users like some of the folks who have been chatting earlier, if they ask a question about, hey, what's going on with this, and we trace it back to a line of code, we couldn't very well say, well, that says closed binary in Solaris, and we'll get back to you as soon as Oracle gets back to us. Right? So the ulterior motive for us is every line of code has to be open. And Nexenta Store 4.0, which comes out in roughly early Q2, will be fully Illumos based. So we're in my perspective is we're extremely happy as one of many supporters of Illumos, the way it's gone and is going. We're going to continue to contribute both core kernel code and also now some user space bits into that community. Sure. Yeah, thank you. Good?
All right. Thank you, Evan.
All right. Thank you again.